The photograph, with its sepia haze and brittle corners, had long been filed away in a shoebox beneath my grandfather's workbench. For years I assumed it was just another one of his quiet mementos from a youth spent near the old tracks that cut through the Vermont countryside. But when I finally held it up to the window, letting the gray daylight slide across its surface, the image opened itself like a sealed memory that had been waiting for the right set of eyes. The locomotive in the foreground dominated the frame, a hulking mass of iron and steam that appeared almost theatrical in the muted afternoon light. But it was the uneasy silence of the people standing beside it that first unsettled me. Their long wool coats drifted slightly with the cold wind, their shapes blurred by the old camera's exposure, though their posture suggested something heavier than mere waiting. They were not passengers delayed by routine. They were witnesses to something they did not yet know how to put into words. The land around them was dying into winter. A thin crust of snow clung to patches of frozen grass, and the bare trees in the distance stood like skeletal guardians against the muted sky. At a glance, the image seemed to show nothing more than a rural stop where nothing much ever happened, a halting pause on a long rail line connecting remote farms to towns that promised warmth and noise. Yet the longer I stared, the more the right side of the photograph began to pull at my attention. There, past the tracks and beyond the passengers, the wreckage of a wooden trestle bridge leaned drunkenly into a half-frozen creek. Its splintered beams twisted upward like broken ribs. One of the freight cars hung in the wreckage, barely visible except for the metal wheel jutting from the tangle of collapsed wood. It didn't match the calm scene in the foreground. The locomotive looked intact. The men and women in their coats stood upright, uninjured. There was no fire, no visible chaos, no desperation. It was as if two moments had been captured at once, the appearance of normalcy and the aftermath of disaster. And yet, according to the neat handwriting on the back, the photograph had been taken minutes after the fall. That single sentence had the tone of someone who believed the details would explain themselves someday, though they never did. When I began researching the location, the details fell into place with uncomfortable speed. The train line in the image belonged to the Rutland Division, a route often burdened by harsh winters and limited maintenance funds. By 1908, several of its bridges were already considered dangerously outdated. Yet scant records remained of any collapse that matched the one in the photograph. Newspaper archives from nearby towns told of blizzards, crop failures, and factory accidents, but nothing about a freight car slipping through a failed trestle. I wondered whether the fall had been quietly resolved without public attention, or whether the collapse had been overshadowed by something else entirely. But there was something else, something that didn't become clear until I enlarged the image using a digital scanner. With the high resolution, the creek came into focus like a scene peeling open. Between the beams of the wreckage caught in the half-melted ice was what looked like the corner of a wooden crate. It might have been nothing more than cargo, a misplaced box that had tumbled during the accident. Yet its positioning struck me as improbably deliberate. It was wedged at an angle that made it look like it hadn't fallen, but been placed. Its sides were reinforced, far sturdier than those used for livestock feed or timber shipments. And faintly, almost lost behind a century of scratches on the photograph, were markings on the crate's surface. Not letters, at least none I could identify, but a symbol, a circle bisected by a vertical line, a mark that had no connection to any known freight company operating in New England in 1908. When I zoomed further, attempting to clarify it, I noticed something even more troubling, a dark smudge behind the crate, shaped not like debris but like fabric, the curve of a shoulder, a fold of cloth. For a moment, the implication made my breath tighten. Had someone been trapped in the wreck? Yet the people in the photograph looked strangely composed, some even calm, not the posture of individuals who had just seen someone plunge into a creek along with an entire rail car. No one was looking toward the wreckage. No one was reaching for help. They stood in a line, all facing the photographer, almost as if the moment had been arranged. So I dug deeper. I searched for work logs, shipment manifests, anything that might connect the wreck to something more than a structural failure. And that was when I found the entry, an internal memo from a regional shipping supervisor, dated early November 1908. It mentioned a restricted consignment scheduled for transport through the Vermont line, a consignment that required limited personnel interaction and no public disclosure due to administrative sensitivity. The memo did not specify contents, but it listed the exact freight car number visible in the photograph, the car in the creek. My grandfather never spoke of the image, not once in all the years I knew him. The shoebox remained tucked away, its contents untouched except for the occasional shift when he dug through tools. But now, knowing he had kept the photograph without explanation, I began to wonder whether he had known more than he ever let on. The bridge collapse, the sealed crate, the quiet witnesses, they formed a narrative shaped not by tragedy, but by omission. Something had been transported along that line, something that was never meant to be seen again once the trestle gave way. What unsettled me most was not the accident itself. It was the silence that followed it. A disaster erased not by time but by intention. And now, with the photograph in my hands, the question that had lived unspoken for a century was no longer avoidable. What exactly had been inside the crate, and why had someone gone to such lengths to ensure nobody asked? The more I searched, the stranger the story became. The shipping logs for the week of the collapse were incomplete, not merely damaged or faded, but deliberately redacted. Whole lines had been removed with a blade, leaving thin scars across the pages. Margins that should have held inspectors' signatures were blank. One ledger even showed signs of having been rewritten, the ink noticeably darker for a single entry that described the car as hauling mechanical supplies. The term was suspiciously vague for a railroad that typically documented shipments with precise detail: lumber quantities, livestock counts, machine parts specified by manufacturer. Nothing else in the archive used a phrase so broad or evasive. I began to track down regional historians, archivists, anyone familiar with early 20th century railroad operations in the Northeast. Most responded with polite uncertainty, expressing curiosity but offering little in the way of answers. Then by chance I came across a retired librarian named Helen Drayton, who had spent decades cataloging materials from the now defunct rail offices. She invited me to her home outside Montpelier, where she kept what she described as unofficial extras, documents never accepted into the public archive for reasons ranging from trivial to questionable. Among the papers she spread across her kitchen table was a folder stamped with the Rutland Division's old crest. Inside, tucked between routine maintenance reports, was a letter dated 2 days before the collapse. It was written by a regional transportation officer whose name did not appear in any other records. The letter warned of an unstable load on one of the freight cars, advising that the cargo should not be exposed to freezing conditions and must be handled per instructions from the requesting institution. The requesting institution was not named. Helen frowned as she read the letter beside me. "This isn't about machine parts," she murmured. "This is about something that couldn't be recorded plainly." I asked whether she had ever encountered similar phrasing in other documents from the era. She hesitated, then disappeared into another room. When she returned, she carried a slim, leather-bound notebook. Inside were handwritten notes referencing a series of special shipments carried out between 1905 and 1910. Most of them were routed through rural lines, and all were tied to contracts issued not by commercial clients, but by government agencies. Some involved experimental equipment. Others were more ambiguous. A few were simply labeled transfers. She admitted she had tried investigating them years earlier but found the trails ended abruptly. "Every time one of these shipments appears," she explained, tapping the notebook, "there's either a missing document or a vague substitute. It's as if the record is built to collapse behind you." That phrase clung to me for days, the idea of a record collapsing deliberately, like the trestle bridge in the photograph. Because the more I compared the documents, the more I noticed the pattern. Every special shipment involved rail lines known for remote stretches, areas with minimal oversight and few witnesses. If something went wrong, if something was lost, there would be no easy way to verify what had been there to begin with, and yet, the collapse captured in my grandfather's photograph seemed to have left behind more evidence than anyone anticipated. I returned to the image, magnifying every corner, examining shadows and reflections, until one detail I had previously dismissed took on new meaning. Just behind the group of passengers, those stoic figures in wool coats, stood a fifth person, half obscured by steam. His hat brim hid his eyes, and his coat was longer than the others, reaching past his knees like a guard's overcoat. His posture differed as well. While the others faced the camera instinctively, following the unspoken rule of early photography, this man stood angled away as if monitoring the wreckage rather than participating in the moment. And the more I studied him, the more I realized something odd. He wasn't standing on solid ground. His boots appeared placed on a section of the embankment that should have sloped downward toward the water. But in the photograph, the ground beneath him looked too level, almost as if a platform or wooden board had been positioned just out of frame. I wondered if he was connected to the shipment. A guard, perhaps, or someone responsible for escorting the cargo. If so, his presence in the photograph might not have been intentional. The witnesses had posed because the photographer asked them to. But the guard, if that was what he was, seemed caught between two obligations: concealment and control. The question lingered. What kind of cargo required oversight in 1908 that could not be listed, could not be exposed to cold, and could not be acknowledged publicly? The answer came unexpectedly during a visit to the State Archive. A researcher there, after hearing my inquiries, disappeared into a back room and returned with a thin box containing correspondence from a defunct medical institution. Inside the box was a 20-page report from 1907 discussing the transport of experimental apparatus designed for behavioral observation studies. The language was clinical but evasive, referring to subjects without identifying them and describing protocols for relocation that mirrored the secrecy in the railroad memos. The institution claimed these transfers were necessary for ensuring appropriate environments for continued study. One line in particular chilled me. Transit should avoid public scrutiny due to ethical sensitivities. Ethical sensitivities. Suddenly, the blurred shape in the wreckage, the fabric-like curve behind the crate, felt less like imagination and more like a remnant of something that had never been meant to be photographed. Something that had been placed inside the freight car with the intention of being transported quietly, invisibly, through the countryside. I reread the report, focusing on the sections describing environmental requirements. The equipment, if that was truly what it was, had to be kept at stable temperatures. Any exposure to freezing conditions would risk irreversible compromise. And so the crate in the photograph, with its reinforced walls and unfamiliar symbol, took on a new dimension. It was not simply cargo. It was containment. Yet the records never identified what was being contained. As I left the archive that evening, snow beginning to gather in the parking lot, I felt the weight of the silence surrounding the collapse settle heavily on me. For the first time, I understood why no newspaper ever reported the disaster. It was not a matter of oversight or distraction. It was management. Someone ensured the story disappeared along with whatever fell into the creek that winter afternoon. And the presence of that guard-like figure in the photograph suggested that whatever had been lost was not supposed to be found. But the photograph survived. And now, for the first time in over a century, its unanswered questions were resurfacing, not through official records, but through the quiet persistence of an image that refused to fade. The silence surrounding the collapse lingered like a fog I couldn't dispel. And the deeper I probed into the archives, the more resistance I encountered, not from people, but from the documents themselves. Pages missing, indexes mislabeled, dates shifted by days or weeks as if someone had attempted to blur the chronology just enough to make reconstruction tedious. The more I learned, the more I felt a dull pressure behind every clue, a sense that the truth had been buried under layers of careful neglect. But neglect always leaves fingerprints. And the photograph, my grandfather's quiet inheritance, was the first of them. I returned to Helen's home with several photocopies in hand, each one revealing a trail that seemed to intersect with the collapsed trestle. She examined the notes in silence, her eyes narrowing at certain phrases, her fingers brushing lightly over the margins as if searching for invisible context. "These terms," she finally said, pointing at the line describing behavioral observation apparatus. Weren't common until much later. Not in 1908. The language feels intentional, almost coded. I agreed. The more I studied the phrasing in the documents, the more it resembled a deliberate vagueness, language designed to satisfy administrators without revealing substance. The kind of wording used when one wants a project funded but not questioned. And then, after hours of comparison, Helen found something I had missed. A handwritten note at the bottom of one of the letters, nearly lost to fading ink. It read, "Transfer required due to facility closure. Subjects must remain secured and undisclosed." Subjects, plural. My heart hammered once, twice, then settled into an uneasy rhythm. Helen's eyes met mine, and she leaned back slowly in her chair. This is no shipment. This was a relocation. A relocation of what neither of us knew. But the implication left a coldness in the room that had nothing to do with the November wind rattling the window panes. I spent the next week trying to identify the facility closure referenced in the note. There were dozens of small research outposts and medical wards in early 20th century Vermont, many of them short-lived, some of them reduced to mere footnotes in county histories. Most focused on public health, agriculture, forestry. None, theoretically, on anything resembling the kind of secretive work suggested by the records. But buried beneath local directories, I found mention of a privately funded observation center located near the town of Northfield, active between 1903 and 1907. No description of its purpose, no list of its administrators, not even a founding date beyond the vague range offered in an 1890s pamphlet. The name alone felt like an answer, given by someone who didn't want to reveal the question. The location of the center was described only as adjacent to the woodlands near the southern ridge, a place so deliberately general it could have been anywhere within a 10-mile radius. And yet a local newspaper from 1904 contained a brief mention of construction activities in the southern forest, referencing the arrival of workers who appeared to be assisting with a private scientific enterprise. The article provided no follow-up. The project dissolved from public knowledge as abruptly as it had emerged. I began to trace the families who had lived in the area at the time, hoping their descendants might know something passed down through whispered cautionary tales or offhand remarks. Most had heard nothing. Some vaguely recalled that their grandparents spoke about government men who came through the woods from time to time. But no one knew what they did. A few old-timers mentioned rumors of strange noises drifting down from the ridge in winter. Howls or mechanical groans, though none agreed on the description. What struck me was not the content of the stories, but the way they were told, distantly, hesitantly, as though they belonged to a time no one wanted to revisit. What I needed was someone whose family had worked on the rail line itself. After weeks of searching, I found him. His name was Douglas Merrill, a soft-spoken man in his late 70s with eyes that seemed to map every thought before he spoke. His grandfather, he said, had been part of a maintenance crew assigned to the Rutland Division in the early 1900s. When I mentioned the trestle collapse, Douglas grew quiet, not confused, quiet, as if the topic had tapped into something dormant, but not forgotten. "I don't know much," he murmured, "but I know he was there." He walked slowly to a metal filing cabinet and returned with a worn notebook, a personal log his grandfather had kept. The entries were sparse, often little more than dates and weather notes, but one page, dated December 1908, contained a passage that made my skin tighten. Bridge down. Took no statements. Told to leave wreck until men from Montpellier arrived. Unusual orders. Crate sunk. Told not to discuss. Crate sunk. The bluntness of the phrase felt like the closest I had come to the truth. But there was more. Another line written faintly below. They wore no railway insignia. I asked Douglas whether he knew who they referred to. He shook his head slowly. My grandfather never talked about that day, he said. But once, only once, he said the wreck wasn't supposed to be seen by the townsfolk. Said the photograph shouldn't have been taken. I froze. He didn't know about my photograph, the one my own grandfather had preserved. And yet here it was. Confirmation that someone had tried to control the narrative even at the moment of disaster. That the image survived at all felt like an anomaly, or a breach in whatever silence had been enforced. Before I left his house, Douglas handed me the notebook. "Keep it," he said. "If it helps you make sense of it, it's yours. None of this should stay buried just because someone wanted it that way." As I stepped outside, the air bit at my skin. The sun was sinking behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the empty road. For the first time, I felt the immensity of what I had stumbled into. The trestle collapse wasn't an accident. It was a point of failure in a larger plan, one that involved secrecy, relocation, and something kept inside a reinforced crate marked with a symbol no one could identify. And someone over a century ago had stood by the tracks, ensuring that whatever fell into that creek remained unspoken. I needed to see the site with my own eyes. Maps from the period indicated the bridge had stood about 7 miles southwest of where the Rutland Line intersected with a small branch route used mainly for logging transport. Most of the railbed had been dismantled decades earlier, swallowed by undergrowth, but with the help of a historian familiar with Vermont's defunct lines, I managed to locate the approximate path. He warned me that the terrain was rough in winter and that much of the area had changed significantly since 1908. But the coordinates he provided matched the angles and contours visible in the photograph. The next morning, armed with a backpack, camera, and photocopies of the old survey maps, I followed the rotting trail of the former rail line through dense forest. The snow was shallow but persistent, crunching softly beneath my boots. The trees stood crowded and silent, their interlocking branches forming a canopy that dimmed the daylight to a perpetual dusk. After an hour of walking, I found the embankment, a raised stretch of earth that once supported the tracks. The wooden ties had long since been removed or swallowed by the soil, but the shape of the path remained. I continued along the embankment until it sloped downward toward a shallow ravine. A creek wound through the center, partially frozen, its surface reflecting a fractured sky. And there, half buried beneath decades of sediment and brush, I saw the remains of the trestle. It was little more now than a scatter of rotting beams jutting from the banks at odd angles. Some timbers still retained enough structure to hint at their former shape. Others crumbled at the slightest touch. I used my photocopied photograph to align the perspective, kneeling until the silhouette of the land matched the image captured in 1908. The position was unmistakable. This was where the freight car fell. I scanned the creek for any sign of the crate or railcar debris but found nothing. A century of winters had wiped the visible traces clean. And yet, something about the landscape felt wrong, subtly altered, as if the ground had been reshaped. A section of soil along the western bank appeared smoother than the surrounding terrain, as though it had been disturbed long after the collapse. When I pressed my boot into it, the earth gave slightly, softer than the frozen ground around it. Someone had dug here. Not recently, but not in 1908 either. Perhaps decades later. The idea unsettled me more than I expected. If the rail officials who controlled the aftermath had recovered the crate immediately, what reason would there be to return years later and reopen the burial site? Unless they hadn't retrieved everything the first time. Unless something had surfaced. As I followed the creek downstream, the wind carried a faint metallic smell, cold, sharp, almost chemical. It faded quickly, leaving no source behind. I checked my surroundings repeatedly, but the forest remained silent except for the steady trickle of water beneath the ice. Further down, the creek widened into a shallow basin where stones jutted through the frost. As I stepped closer, my boot struck something not stone. I knelt and brushed away the snow. Metal. A corroded fragment of iron, no larger than my hand, curved along one edge. My breath caught. It looked like part of a railcar wheel assembly, the same type partially visible in the old photograph. The piece was heavily decayed, but its contour was unmistakable. I photographed it from several angles, using the shadows to emphasize its ridges. If this small fragment had survived, perhaps more remained buried along the creek bed. Just as I pocketed the coordinates for later documentation, a voice carried through the trees. Looking for something? I turned sharply. A man stood on the opposite side of the creek, bundled in a thick winter coat, a wool cap pulled low over his brow. His face was half shadowed, but his posture was relaxed, not aggressive, not startled. It was the ease of someone who had been watching for a while. "I'm researching the old trestle collapse," I said cautiously. "Most folks don't come out here for that." His tone was even, almost matter-of-fact. "Hardly anyone even remembers it." "Do you?" I asked. He paused, a fraction of a second, but enough to register. "My grandfather talked about it once," he replied. "Said it wasn't the fall that bothered him. It was what they pulled out of the water." A chill crawled up my spine. "What did they pull out?" I asked quietly. He studied me with an expression I couldn't read. "You wouldn't believe me." "Try me." He hesitated again, then spoke. He said there were crates. One broke open. Something inside got damaged. They covered it with a tarp before anyone else could see. I felt the air thicken around us. Did he say what it was? No. The man shook his head slowly. Only that the men who arrived later, official-looking men, told everyone to keep away. They hauled off what they could and left the rest. Told the crew it was just equipment. The wind shifted, carrying a faint creak through the trees like distant wood under strain. "Why did you come out here today?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. He gave a thin, unreadable smile. "Saw someone walking the line from the ridge. Figured you weren't hunting or surveying." He nodded toward the embankment. "People don't usually come out here unless they're looking for answers." I swallowed. "Are you saying others have come?" He didn't answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was low. "A few, not many. Some years back, there were men doing work near the banks. Looked like they were excavating something. They didn't stay long. The disturbed soil I had noticed." "Did they find anything?" He shrugged. "Hard to tell. They left in a hurry when the weather turned." I wanted to ask more, but the man glanced at the darkening sky. "Snow's coming. You don't want to be out here when it hits." Without another word, he stepped back into the trees. "Wait," I called, but he was already gone, his footsteps muted by the soft ground, his figure swallowed by the forest. I stood alone beside the creek, heart pounding, the fragment in the water, the disturbed soil, the stranger's sudden appearance. The implications were no longer abstract. Whatever had fallen into the creek in 1908 had not remained forgotten. Someone had returned for it, maybe more than once. And now, I realized with creeping certainty, someone knew I was looking. The stranger's disappearance into the trees left a vacuum of sound behind him, an unnatural quiet that pressed on my ears as though the forest itself were withholding something. I waited several minutes listening for his footsteps or the snap of a branch, but nothing came. The woods settled into stillness, broken only by the brittle crackle of the creek shifting beneath its thin crust of ice. I turned my attention back to the trestle remains, determined to study what I could before the snow arrived. Yet as I knelt beside the corroded metal fragment, the unease lingered like a second presence at my shoulder. The stranger's story wasn't surprising. It was confirming. Someone had returned to the site, likely decades after the collapse. They'd searched with purpose, not curiosity. And if the disturbed soil was any indication, they had either found something worth taking or concealed something better left buried. The question now wasn't whether the crate's contents mattered. It was why they mattered enough for people to return long after the event had been erased from public record. I followed the creek upstream, seeking a vantage point where the trestle's footprint was more visible. As I moved, I examined the embankment carefully, searching for patterns in the soil. A few places caught my eye, patches where the grass grew unevenly, or where the ground had settled in ways that suggested past displacement. These were faint clues, softened by time, but still legible to anyone who knew to look. At one such patch, near an uprooted spruce, I found a depression in the earth no more than a foot wide. When I brushed away the leaves, I uncovered a rusted bolt, thick with mineral buildup. A bolt of the type used not for railcar assembly, but for securing crates. This discovery, insignificant in isolation, took on weight in context. Someone had removed the crate from the water and brought at least part of it ashore. Whether they opened it here or transported it elsewhere remained unclear, but the bolt's presence confirmed that the crate had not simply remained submerged and lost. As I pocketed the bolt, the air shifted. A low groan echoed through the ravine, like wind threading through hollow timber, although the trees around me were still. I scanned the forest, pulse quickening, unsure whether the sound was natural or one of those echoes that drifted unpredictably through cold, empty spaces. The unease that had shadowed me since the stranger's arrival deepened. The forest had been silent too long. The absence of birds, of small life rustling beneath the undergrowth, felt purposeful, as though the woods held their breath around outsiders. Determined not to leave without documenting the site thoroughly, I climbed the embankment to where the rail line would have extended north. From here I could see the distant ridge, steep, remote, and forested heavily enough to conceal the ruins of any building that once stood there. If the observation center had indeed operated near the ridge, as the historical note suggested, then the route used to transport its subjects would have passed close to this very trestle. That alone created a plausible link between the facility and the collapse. Yet plausibility wasn't enough. I needed evidence. Back at home that evening, I spread my findings across the table. Maps, notes, the bolt, the photographed metal fragment, the enlarged image of the crate. I replayed the stranger's words over and over in my mind. What they pulled out of the water. Not something, but what? The phrasing implied familiarity, as though his grandfather had recognized the contents, or at least had some expectation of what the crate was meant to hold. But then there was the tarp. Why cover something immediately? Why shield it from witnesses if it was only machinery or institutional equipment? Unless it wasn't equipment at all. In search of any additional context, I revisited the files from the defunct medical institution. One report, the one discussing behavioral observation apparatus, contained a peculiar reference. Protocols for transportation should remain consistent with the handling and transfer of test subjects. The wording was bureaucratic, yet revealing. It placed the equipment in relation to subjects, implying interaction between them. Machines designed to observe, or something else, something reliant on the presence of human or animal subjects? The report's evasiveness suggested the latter. While cross-referencing the report's terminology with early 20th century scientific literature, I stumbled upon a series of publications from universities in the Northeast, many of which discussed experimental studies involving behavioral conditioning structures. These structures varied widely, from controlled environment chambers to crude sensory isolation units. Most were designed to test responses to environmental stimuli, light, sound, temperature. Though primitive by modern standards, some required precise conditions, which aligned disturbingly well with the crate's reinforced construction and the memo warning against exposure to freezing temperatures. One paper mentioned that such devices were sometimes transported between institutions for collaborative studies. A footnote added that the equipment, often large and costly, was typically moved discreetly due to concerns about public misunderstanding. The idea that these early devices could be mistaken or sensationalized by the public struck me as plausible. Yet none of the described apparatuses featured the unique symbol found on the crate. That unexplained circle bisected by a vertical line was unlike any manufacturer's mark I could locate. It wasn't a university insignia, nor a commercial trademark, nor a government emblem. Its meaning eluded me, giving the crate an aura of clandestine purpose beyond scientific experimentation. In desperation, I turned to an academic forum where obscure symbols and institutional markings were occasionally identified by experts. I uploaded a cropped image of the crate's symbol, stripped of context, and waited. Days passed with no response. Then, nearly a week later, a retired professor of early 20th century industrial design messaged me privately. He wrote, "I cannot identify the symbol. It is not industrial, academic, or military. But I have seen similar marks used internally within private research groups to denote proprietary projects. These marks often lack external records. If your image is authentic and dated to 1908, It may pertain to one of the small, independent research circles active during that time. Private research circles. That phrase opened a new line of inquiry. While mainstream scientific institutions left abundant documentation, small privately funded research groups often operated outside public scrutiny. They pursued unconventional or controversial studies, free from oversight. Some consisted of only a handful of individuals, wealthy patrons or eccentric theorists, people with the means to conduct experiments without fear of ethical reprisal. One such group, referenced only briefly in a 1906 newspaper article, was rumored to have operated in the Vermont Highlands, allegedly conducting experiments related to cognitive isolation and the effects of sensory deprivation. The group's funding source was never identified, nor were its members. The article dismissed the rumors as rural exaggeration, but several locals insisted that strange equipment had been hauled through the woods during those years. Equipment that needed secrecy, equipment transported under guarded conditions, equipment that could easily be mistaken for something else if glimpsed by the wrong eyes. I realized then that the crate may not have held machinery at all. Or if it did, the machinery might have been designed not to conduct experiments but to confine them. This possibility reframed everything. The secrecy, the lack of documentation, the presence of guards, the insistence on silence. What if the crate contained not a device but a subject? What if the relocation referenced in the letter had been of people? As the idea took shape, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. The early 1900s were rife with institutional abuses. Orphans relocated without consent, individuals with disabilities taken into custody, impoverished families separated under the guise of public welfare. Governments and private institutions alike moved vulnerable individuals between facilities with minimal documentation. If the crate contained people, subjects removed from the observation center during its closure, then the collapse was not merely an accident. It was a catastrophe buried under the weight of silence. When I looked again at the photograph, the blurred shape in the wreckage, the one I had initially thought might be fabric, seemed no longer ambiguous. It appeared human. A shoulder, the edge of an arm. The cloth looked heavy like institutional linen. And I realized with sudden dread that the calmness of the people in the photograph was not the calm of ignorance. It was the calm of people trained, or ordered, not to react. Someone had made sure the image told no story at first glance. But now, the story was unfolding, impossible to ignore. Something, someone, had been inside that crate. And the fall had set them free, if only for a moment, before the men from Montpellier arrived to hide what remained. The silence was no longer mysterious. It was engineered, and I had just begun to understand why. The more I considered the possibility of human cargo, the more the scattered fragments of evidence aligned into a troubling narrative. The phrasing in the documents, the secrecy surrounding the relocation, the absence of public reports, each piece hinted at an institutional practice designed to move people without scrutiny. The question, then, was what kind of individuals would require such clandestine transportation in 1908? Not criminals. They were typically documented, even if poorly. Not the mentally ill. Large asylums and workhouses moved such individuals semi-publicly, with overseers and transfer logs. This left a narrower category. Individuals who were neither patients nor prisoners but subjects, participants in experiments conducted far from public view. Subjects whose existence was not officially recorded, whose identities were known only to the private institutions that handled them. As I delved into early 20th century medical ethics, if ethics was even the appropriate word, I discovered numerous cases where institutions conducted experiments on orphan children, impoverished immigrant families, or those considered socially undesirable. These individuals were often placed into programs without consent, their fates sealed by bureaucratic signatures that carried the force of authority, but none of the transparency expected today. If the observation center had conducted such work, then its closure would have presented a logistical dilemma. What to do with the subjects? They could not be released into the public, nor transferred to mainstream institutions without exposing the nature of the experiments. The only solution would have been relocation to another private facility, quietly, discreetly, by night or by remote rail lines. The crate in the photograph was large enough to serve as a containment structure for either individuals or specialized equipment intended to moderate their environment. The reinforcement of the walls, the warning about freezing temperatures, the guard-like figure overseeing the scene, each detail suggested that the contents required stability, not merely security. And yet, something still felt unaccounted for. The heavy tarp used to conceal the crate's contents after the collapse implied the presence of something visible, something recognizable to those who arrived first. But what could have been so potentially compromising that officials rushed to cover it immediately? I couldn't shake the image of the blurred shape in the wreckage. The fabric, the shape of a shoulder, the strange curvature of the surface near the crate. It was almost human, yet indistinct enough to second-guess. What if I had misinterpreted that shape entirely? What if the subject wasn't a person at all, but something linked to the apparatus mentioned in the report? Some early experimental device designed to study behavior under sensory deprivation or isolation. Such devices often involved enclosing subjects, sometimes animals, sometimes people, for long durations in confined spaces. If a subject had been within the crate, the collapse might have resulted in immediate injury or death, prompting officials to remove the evidence before local witnesses could understand what they had seen. As I sat sifting through records late into the night, a sudden connection emerged, one that made the hair on my arm stand on end. The early 1900s saw the emergence of a controversial movement known as isolation therapy, believed by some researchers to possess the capacity to reset cognitive pathways. Proponents claimed it could restore mental faculties in individuals with certain developmental conditions by removing external stimuli for prolonged periods. Most respected physicians dismissed the practice as unscientific and inhumane, but fringe groups, private, well-funded, unregulated, experimented with it anyway. The term subject appeared frequently in their internal communications. One group, in particular, operated in the Northeast. Its name appeared only once, the New England Isolation Study Circle. The references were sparse, an oblique mention in a newspaper editorial criticizing unethical research practices, a footnote in an academic paper warning against experimental extremism, and a passing remark in a letter from a well-known physician who refused to collaborate with them. The circle was rumored to have tested sensory deprivation chambers on children from impoverished communities. Though never confirmed, the whispers were enough to cast a dark shadow over their activities. If the observation center was one of their facilities, the relocation of subjects would have been carried out with extreme caution, and the collapse of the trestle, right in the path between the ridge and the main rail line, suggested their secrecy had intersected with catastrophe. One detail nagged at me. The man in the photograph, the one I suspected was a guard. If he belonged to the Circle's network, his presence at the scene made chilling sense. He might have been responsible for ensuring the crate's delivery, and when the collapse occurred, he might have been tasked with overseeing the immediate containment of whatever had spilled from the wreck. But why hadn't the photographer been stopped? Why had the image survived? The answer came from the convergence of several clues: the bystanders' unnatural composure, the lack of railway insignia on the arriving officials, and the haste with which the crate was concealed. It struck me that the photographer may not have understood what he had captured, not at the time, and the officials may have believed the photograph ordinary, not realizing the background revealed the collapsed crate. In a world without rapid film development, they couldn't have known what the final image showed. By the time prints were made, the event was long past. I stared at the photograph again, magnifying the guard's posture. What struck me now was his orientation. Not facing the camera, but angled just enough to survey the wreckage. This wasn't a man caught accidentally in the frame. This was a man performing oversight, intermediate between two worlds, the world of witnesses and the world of secrets. The secrecy surrounding the trestle collapse took on new dimension when I discovered an obscure court document from 1910 referencing compensation claims denied to maintenance workers involved in an incident that fell under federal jurisdiction. The document did not specify the incident, merely that federal involvement voided local claims. The workers attempting to file for compensation had cited injury and psychological distress. Their claims were rejected. Why federal involvement? A simple rail accident wouldn't trigger such intervention, but a federal mandate to erase a disaster tied to private institutional malpractice, that was something else entirely. The phrase, psychological distress, echoed in my mind. Workers traumatized by what they saw, by the contents of the crate, by the sight of human subjects injured or killed, or by something more profound, something that unsettled them at a fundamental level. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the significance of the collapse extended far beyond the individuals involved. It revealed a hidden system operating parallel to official structures, using rural infrastructure as a conduit for quiet, ethically dubious practices. The trestle collapse had fractured not just a bridge, but the secrecy surrounding these practices. And someone, perhaps multiple someones, had spent decades stitching the fracture shut, burying evidence, redacting documents, and controlling narratives. But the photograph remained, a silent witness that could not be destroyed without destroying a family's memory. My grandfather had kept it without explanation. Perhaps he didn't know the story behind it, or perhaps he knew more than he ever said. The shoebox beneath his workbench had always seemed an odd place to store a photograph, but maybe it wasn't a hiding place. Maybe it was simply where he kept the things that troubled him. Memories he could not discard but could not bear to display. I decided then that the next step was unavoidable. I needed to find the location of the observation center itself. Whatever answers remained were not in archives or hearsay or lingering fragments of metal. They were at the ridge where the center had stood hidden from the world. If the rumors were true, then the truth had been waiting more than a century for someone willing to walk through those woods, look past the silence, and confront what had been left behind. The observation rooms, the chambers, the subjects, the experiments, all of it, and whatever the circle had tried so hard to bury. I packed my maps and notes, knowing that the ridge held more than the ruins of a forgotten institution. It held the final chapter of a story no one had ever intended to be told. The ridge loomed like a dark boundary as I approached it at dawn, its silhouette fractured by the bare winter branches that clung stubbornly to the steep incline. Snow dusted the earth in a thin, brittle sheet, crunching underfoot as I climbed with slow, deliberate steps. Every direction felt claustrophobic, as if the trees themselves leaned inward, pressing close in anticipation. The trail, such as it was, had been claimed by decades of erosion, leaving only faint depressions in the soil where boots once passed during the institution's active years. The air sharpened with altitude, thinning into something metallic and cold, tinged faintly with the scent of pine sap. I paused halfway up the ridge, glancing back toward the valley where the trestle once stood. From that height, the ravine was nearly invisible, swallowed by the forest. Only my knowledge of the land allowed me to trace the approximate line of the former railroad as it curved through the trees. The thought that subjects, people or otherwise, had once been brought from this ridge to that doomed trestle lent an uncanny coherence to the landscape. These woods had once carried secrets, and now I walked the same path, retracing a journey that had remained unspoken for more than a century. The trail steepened abruptly, forcing me to use exposed roots and rocks as handholds. My breath fogged the air, dissipating quickly into the cold. After 20 minutes of climbing, the ground leveled out into a plateau, a natural clearing that offered a panoramic view of both the valley and the distant mountains. It was here, according to the earliest reference I'd found, that the observation center once stood. At first, I saw nothing but trees. But as I advanced into the clearing, the forest yielded its first clue, a sunken rectangle of stone, almost flush with the soil, softened by moss and decades of fallen leaves. It was the foundation of a building, one large enough to have accommodated multiple rooms. The edges formed a distinct outline, unmistakably human in design. I knelt, clearing debris away from one corner. Beneath the dirt, a rusted hinge jutted from the stone, the last remnant of a metal doorframe. The building had not simply decayed, it had been dismantled, removed piece by piece as if someone wanted no trace left behind. But traces did remain. I moved slowly across the foundation, careful to disturb as little as possible. The snow concealed subtle irregularities, drag marks, shallow dips, unnatural mounds. When I brushed the snow aside in one place, I uncovered a concrete slab cracked down the center, as though something heavy had smashed it from within. The fracture radiated outward like a spiderweb, jagged and violent. I studied it with growing unease. Concrete wasn't widely used for small private buildings in 1907, yet here it was, poured thick and reinforced with iron rods. Someone had invested heavily in this structure, and someone had attempted to destroy it. Near the far corner of the foundation lay a rusted metal bracket still attached to a stone block. It had once supported heavy equipment, perhaps the apparatus mentioned in the institutional reports. But the block beside it bore deep gouges, scratches that curved in unnatural arcs, as if something had scraped along the surface repeatedly. The marks appeared neither random nor mechanical. They were deliberate patterns, spaced evenly yet erratic in angle, as though whoever or whatever made them had been enclosed and moving unpredictably. A chill climbed my spine. I forced myself to document everything: the foundation, the scratches, the hinge, the broken concrete. The act of recording helped maintain a sense of rational detachment, though it didn't soothe the questions rising in my mind. What experiments had occurred here? What subjects had been confined within these walls? And what remained after the institution's abrupt closure, prompting its operators to remove everything but the foundation? I followed the edge of the structure until I reached the northern side, where the stone abruptly ended in a fractured slope. Here I found something that stopped me cold: the remnants of a tunnel entrance. The opening had been filled with rocks and soil long ago, but the arching stone still revealed its shape: a narrow passage leading underground, a place for storage or containment. I dropped to one knee, pressing my ear against the cold stones. Silence. But something in the air felt wrong, the faintest draft seeping from between the collapsed rocks, carrying with it a scent that didn't belong to the mountains. Sterile, dry, almost chemical. A scent like dust sealed in an old hospital ward. The tunnel led somewhere. I circled the blocked entrance, searching for signs of collapse versus intentional sealing. The rubble was too clean. The stones had been placed, not fallen, each one fitted tightly against the next. Someone had sealed the tunnel with precision, not in despair, but with purpose. The reports from the defunct institution echoed through my mind. Subjects must remain secured and undisclosed. If the crate in the trestle was part of a relocation, then the original subjects, or what remained of them, might once have been housed within this very tunnel system. The idea unsettled me, but I pressed forward, refusing to turn back. 50 feet beyond the tunnel entrance, I found the remains of a smaller structure, a series of low stone walls barely visible beneath vegetation. It appeared to have been a secondary building, perhaps for storage or preparation. Inside the outline, I discovered fragments of metal piping and shards of glass so thick they resembled components of reinforced windows or observation lenses. This was no simple rural laboratory. It was a facility designed for controlled environments. Near the center of the ruins, I found a rusted metal plate half buried in earth. When I lifted it, my breath caught. Beneath the plate was a wooden board, rotten but intact enough to reveal black stenciled lettering. Only a few words were still legible. Restricted transfer protocol required. The lettering matched the style used in some of the memos I'd found. This was the missing piece connecting the trestle collapse to the ridge. The subjects were kept here, and they were moved, and something went wrong. I recorded the plank, gently replacing it to prevent further decay. As I stood, a gust of wind blew through the clearing, a sudden, forceful blast that carried the brittle scent of old timber and cold stone. It died as quickly as it came, replaced once again by silence. But I had heard something else inside that wind. A faint metallic clatter like a loose hinge, like a door disturbed. I turned toward the sealed tunnel. The sound came again. And this time, it didn't sound like the wind at all. I stepped toward the sealed tunnel with slow, deliberate movements. The air around the entrance had grown noticeably colder, enough that my breath thickened instantly into fog. The clearing seemed to shrink behind me, the trees leaning inward, as though the forest itself was holding vigil. I crouched beside the rubble, placing a gloved hand on the stone. It vibrated faintly, so faintly that I wasn't sure whether I felt it through the rock or through the tension in my own arm. Then the metallic clatter returned, softer this time, almost like an echo from deep underground. Not wind, not settling stone. Something deeper. I leaned in, listening as closely as I dared. For a long moment, there was nothing. Only the thin draft breathing through the gaps. Then unexpectedly a different sound emerged, a distant shuffling, irregular, like the drag of something across a hard floor. It lasted less than a second. Then silence reclaimed the tunnel. I expected fear to overwhelm me, but what flooded through instead was an intense, driven curiosity, the understanding that I stood inches from the last untouched piece of a century-old mystery. Whatever lay beyond that barrier had remained sealed, undisturbed, and undocumented for more than 100 years. Yet now it whispered hints of presence, of history, of unfinished stories. I forced myself to stand, retreating a few paces to steady my breath. The logical explanation was simple. The tunnel system beneath the center was extensive enough that temperature shifts or small internal collapses could produce sounds. But something in the cadence, the human unpredictability of the shuffling, did not resemble mere structural noise. I turned away, reminding myself that the truth didn't require me to enter the tunnel. Not yet. My goal was documentation, not recklessness. I walked back toward the main foundation, attempting to ground myself in physical evidence again. I photographed the broken concrete slab, the gouged stone, the hinge embedded in the foundation, each detail a fragment of what once transpired here. When I reached the southern edge of the site, I noticed an unnatural mound of earth, its slope too symmetrical for natural formation. I brushed away snow with my boot, revealing wooden planks arranged in a grid-like pattern beneath the soil. The boards were weathered nearly to dust, but the arrangement unmistakably resembled a floor, one built above ground, possibly as the base of a temporary structure. I knelt, examining the seam between two planks. A sliver of metal peeked through. I used a small brush to uncover it fully. It was a brass tag, no larger than a coin, punctured with 2 nail holes on either side. I lifted it carefully, feeling the brittle cold of the metal. Stamped on its face, barely visible beneath oxidation, was a single word: Ward. My breath hitched. It wasn't uncommon for early 20th century institutions, especially private ones, to label rooms or areas with metal tags. But the word ward suggested the presence of living quarters or confinement areas meant for human subjects. The temporary structure beneath the clearing may have housed them at some point, perhaps during the dismantling of the main building. If the circle transferred their human subjects to the trestle using crates, it was possible that the subjects were kept here first, awaiting relocation. The idea tightened something in my chest. This ridge had once echoed with voices, frightened, confused, or simply resigned. People whose stories had been stripped away, leaving only traces scattered across the mountain. A faint gust swept the clearing again, carrying a low creak from the sealed tunnel. I closed my hand around the brass tag, letting its cold shape anchor me. As the day wore on, the sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ruins. I worked methodically, taking careful notes, marking the locations of each discovery. Yet my attention kept drifting back toward the tunnel, drawn by an inexplicable pull. I needed, to know what lay inside. But to break the seal would be to cross into unknown territory, both ethically and physically. I reminded myself that recklessness would help no one. Still, as I prepared to leave the clearing, something near the tunnel caught my eye. A glint of metal, half buried in soil. I approached cautiously, kneeling to brush it free. It was a thin piece of machinery, an iron ring connected to a broken latch, the kind used to secure heavy doors from inside. The break in the latch was jagged, torn rather than cut. Something had forced it open. A surge of unease gripped me. Had the door been broken from within or from outside? And if from within, what had needed to escape? I documented the latch, placing it inside a padded pouch. But as I slipped it into my bag, I felt an unexpected weight settle over me. For the first time, it became clear that the collapse of the trestle may not have been the only accident associated with the circle's activities. The ridge itself felt like a wound, sealed but not healed. I made my way down the mountain before dusk, my boots sliding on icy patches as I descended. The forest's silence clung to me, broken only by the rasp of wind across the branches. When I reached the valley floor and looked back at the ridge, it loomed darkly against the reddening sky, its crest lined with barren trees like watchmen or sentinels. Back home, I spread the day's findings across the table, organizing them in sequence. The brass tag, the latch, the photographs, the notes. The evidence was no longer subtle. It was overwhelming. This wasn't a story of a bridge collapse. It wasn't even a story of secret research. It was a story of containment, a story of subjects moved in darkness, a story of a facility dismantled with precision to erase the truth. I turned to the photograph, the one that had begun all this, the crate's symbol, the shadowed shape, the guard, the calm witnesses, the bridge collapse. The freight car half buried in the creek, carrying a secret that was never meant to escape the woods. And now, the sealed tunnel, still breathing faint whispers into the cold stone. The past was no longer buried. It was waiting. And after more than a century of silence, it had finally found someone who would listen.